And I do apologize that I do not wear a tie tonight. I was too involved in wearing suspenders to match Donnie that I forgot all about my tie. So please excuse that. We are studying in our lesson tonight, continuing, of course, with Old Testament characters, and we have been looking at those particularly who were judges of the children of Israel. And one thing we've said about the judges is that we need to get out of our mind the concept of a man in a black robe and the scene of a courtroom, because that is by no means the type of judges that we have been studying, and that's also true of the ones tonight and the ones that we'll continue to be studying. So, looking at number 7 in Judges, and of course, always remembering that it's worthwhile for us to study the Old Testament, many lessons, and as Romans 15 and verse 4 says, they are written for our learning. So any lessons that we can learn from these characters, from the events that we can read about, certainly is well worth our while. Looking at number 7 in our list of judges was Tola. And we read about him in Judges 10 and in those first 2 verses. After Abimelech arose to save Israel, Tola, the son of Pua, the son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, and he dwelt in Shamir in the mountains of Ephraim. He judged Israel 23 years, and he died and was buried in Shamir. That's all we have concerning, just what's in these 2 verses. We do not know who the oppressor was of Israel. There's not that customary statement that we usually find that there was peace and Israel did that which was right in their own eyes. God oppressed them by some enemy nation that oppressed them for some period of time, and then God gave rise to a judge to deliver them. We have none of the details of that. Instead, all we have given is that he judged Israel for 23 years, and that he was of the tribe of Issachar, and is buried in Shamir. When we first did the introduction study of judges, we said there would be several of these judges that we would know very little, if anything, about. And so Tola fits into that description, as well as Jair. We read about him in verses 3, 4, and 5 of chapter 10. After him, that is Tola, arose Jair, a Gileadite, I'll get it right, and he judged Israel 22 years. Now he had 30 sons that rode on 30 donkeys. They also had 30 towns, which are called Haveth Jair to this day, which are in the land of Gilead. And Jair died and was buried in Hammon. So again, all that we know is just in these 3 verses, and that is, he judged Israel for 22 years. He was a Gileadite. He had 30 sons that rode upon 30 donkeys and had 30 towns in which were named or given to them. And Jair, was buried in Hammon. Again, no details as to who the possible oppressor may have been, other than just a little bit of information that we've been given in these 3 verses. But that, of course, leads us to the rest of the remaining verses in chapter 10. Not completely all of them, but basically all of them. And it pretty much just describes for us, after Jair, the condition that Israel is in. We see that they continue to worship other false gods, that we see in verse 6. We see that, again, this repeated cycle again repeats itself. The Lord was angry with them and sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Amorites for some 18 years. That we read in verses 7, 8, and 9. And yet again, Israel calls out for God to deliver them. in verses 10 through 16. And they assemble together, but they have no deliverer. They have no one in charge, so to speak, in verses 16 through 18. So this is where chapter 11 begins, and we are introduced to yet another judge, and that is Jephthah. Jephthah, we read about in chapter 11, verse 1, all the way through the first 7 verses of chapter 12. And I hope that as we said at the very end of our study last week, that you did take time to read these verses, because we'll not take the time or have the time to do so in our study tonight. Jephthah was the son of Gideon. He is stated in verses 1 and 2 as being a mighty man of valor, but we're told that he was the son of a harlot and that his family drove him out. So this is the first information that we're given concerning Jephthah. And we even see in verse 5 that the elders of Israel went to find him to become their commander to overtake the oppressor, the Amorites. And we see Jephthah negotiating with the Amorites in verses 12 through 27. In fact, he gathers troops and he makes war against the Amorites in verse 29. And then we read in verse 30 that Jephthah makes a vow to the Lord. And let's read that vow, if we will, Jeremy.
You will indeed deliver the people of Ammon into my hand, then it will be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the people of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's. I will offer it up as a burnt offering.
So this is the vow. In fact, if there's ever a story or a sermon that we've ever heard on Jephthah, usually this is the principal thing that is pointed out in his story of his life. So we see that the Lord indeed does deliver the Amorites into his hands in verse 33. And in verse 34, when he returns from his victory, his only child, a daughter, was the first one to greet him. So remembering the vow that he made in verse 30, this is the first one to come from his house to greet him or welcome him as a result of now the battle having been finished. And of course, what we see is that he had to fulfill his vow to God. We also see that the men of the tribe of Ephraim became angry with Jephthah because he had not asked them to go with him to war against the Ammonites. And that we read as we start opening up chapter 12 and read there in verse 1. So Jephthah gathers the men of Gilead and fights against the men of Ephraim in verse 4. And the Gileadites, they seize the fords of the Jordan before the Ephraimites are able to get there. And so we see that they would not let the Ephraimites cross the fords. And we read in verse 6 that there were 42,000 Ephraimites that were killed. We read in verse 7 of chapter 12 that Jephthah was the judge of Israel for 6 years. And verse 7 also tells us that he died and was buried in among the cities of Gilead. So that's the story of Jephthah that we read about in chapters 11 and first 7 verses of chapter 12. So, as we always try to make the point in studying any Old Testament character is what lesson can possibly be learned from this judge. One lesson that truly I think stands out is that we must be a keeper of our word. And that's what we see in him. You know, we just have to remind ourselves of verses 30 and 31 concerning that vow, that promise that he made concerning if God would give him the victory over the Ammonites, here is what he would do. The first one that would come from his house, he would offer unto the Lord. And we know that God indeed granted Jephthah's request, and now it's time for him to keep his vow to God. You can only know, obviously, that Jephthah did not expect his daughter, of all people, to be the one that would first come from his house to meet him. But yet, to keep the vow, he had to be a very hard thing for him to do. I mean, put yourself in his shoes. Not only a daughter, not only a child, but your own child. That's what we must understand, that this was more than just a daughter. She was the only child of this man. So you can only imagine how hard it was for him to fulfill this vow. Because in one manner of speaking, we need to realize, and I guess, well, I know we don't put that much emphasis on lineage, the carrying on of our posterity as they did in ancient times. But since this was his only child, his only offspring, this means that the lineage, the ancestry of Jephthah is going to end. It's going to stop right here. There will be no descendants of Jephthah other than just the fact that he had this one daughter. So let's look at what he tells his daughter there in verse 35. Brother Mathis, read that for us.
And it came to pass when he saw her that he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You are among those who trouble me, for I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot go back on it.
So notice what he says. I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot go back on it. So we see what promises, what vows ought to mean, the significance, the importance that we need to put upon our words and that which we say that we'll do something. And so, as difficult and as heartbreaking as this had to be, Jephthah kept his vow to God. Now, I didn't really intend to talk about this, but I think it's maybe something that would be on our mind, and it's not on your outline, by the way. But there is that question. Did Jephthah sacrifice or did he consecrate his daughter? Because these are the two things that you hear the most of when it comes to a discussion of Jephthah. Did he really offer her as a burnt offering, as verse 31 states? Or is it a situation where that she is not able to go ahead and marry, and he has consecrated her in service unto the Lord? So what I thought I would do, and what I did too, was to look at verse 31 in connection with what Adam Clarke who is a commentator, if you were to ask me what my two most favorite commentators are, it wouldn't be Adam Clark number one. It would probably be Albert Barnes number one, and it would be Adam Clark number two. But going with his statement first, he uses the Hebrew translation of verse 31. And he says the translation of which, according to the most accurate Hebrew scholars, is this: I will consecrate it to the Lord, or I will offer it for a burnt offering. That is, if it be a thing fit for a burnt offering, it shall be made one. If fit for the service of God, it shall be consecrated to him. And he goes on and says, and I think I added a sentence in there that I needed to take out. So forget to recall Jephthah's vow, but that of course would be something, because this is what this comment is made on concerning verses 30 and 31. He goes on and makes this statement to justify his conclusion that she was consecrated and not sacrificed. He says the human sacrifices were always an abomination to the Lord. And this is one of the reasons why God drove out the Canaanites and etc. Because they offered their sons and daughters to Molech, an idol god, in the fire. That is, they made burnt offerings of them, as is generally supposed. And Leviticus 18 and verse 21, God said, you shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. And then he gives 2 Kings 23 verse 10, said that he defiles Tola, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or his daughter pass through the fire to Molech. And then Jeremiah, he quotes, makes this statement in chapter 32 and verse 35, that they built the high places of Baal, which are in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire to Molech, which I did not command them, nor did it come into my mind that they should do this abomination, to cause Judah to sin. So, having given this to substantiate the statement that he makes concerning human sacrifices were considered an abomination, he says that from Judges 11, verses 38 through 40, so he says, go. And he sent her away for 2 months. And she went with her friends and bewailed her virginity on the mountains. And it was so at the end of 2 months that she returned to her father, and he carried out his vow with her which he had vowed. She knew no man. And it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went 4 days each year to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. It appears evident that Jephthah's daughter was not sacrificed to God, but consecrated to God like Hannah did Samuel in 1 Samuel 1, verse 11, and in verse 28. And I'm sure we're familiar with Hannah during the time of Eli. She was barren. She pleaded to God for a son and promised that if God would give her a son, she would consecrate it. She would give it to the Lord. And of course, that's what we read about in 1 Samuel 1. And that's what Adam Clark is referring to substantiate his idea that what Jephthah did was to consecrate his daughter. Now, concerning that Hebrew text where it said that I will consecrate it to the Lord, or I will offer it for a burnt offering, the word or in the place of the word and that you have in your King James, in your New King James, or NIV, or whatever, because the reason I'm saying that is that I looked up that verse in 53 different translations, and there was only one translation that translated it the way that Adam Clark said that the Hebrew correctly translated it. And it was in Young's literal translation, and I quoted it here. Then it hath been that which at all cometh out from the doors of my house to meet me in my turning back in peace from the Ben Ammon. It hath been to Jehovah, or I will have offered up for it a burnt offering. And really, that's not exactly what Adam Clark was saying that the Hebrew stated, because he was basically just saying that instead of the word and, there was the word or. But like I said, I looked that up in something over 50 different translations, and they all read the same as they do in the King James, New King James, American Standard, Revised Standard, or whatever, the more possible translations that you might use. So, let's look at Albert Barnes. He says, the words of this verse prove conclusively that Jephthah intended his vow to apply to human beings, not animals, for only one of his household could be expected to come forth from the door of his house to meet him. They also preclude any other meaning than that Jephthah contemplated a human sacrifice. This needs not, however, surprise us when we recollect his Syrian birth and his long residence in a Syrian city, where such fierce rites were probably common. The Syrians and the Phoenicians were conspicuous among the ancient pagan nations for human sacrifices, and the transfer under such circumstances to Yahweh, which of course is God, of the rites with which the false gods were honored is just what one might expect. The circumstances of the Spirit of the Lord coming on Jephthah in Judges 11 and verse 29 is no difficulty, as it by no means follows that because the Spirit of God endowed him with supernatural valor and energy for vanquishing the Amorites, he therefore also endued him with spiritual knowledge and wisdom. The Spirit of God came upon Gideon, Judges 6:34, but that did not prevent his erring in the matter of the ephod, Judges chapter 8 and verse 27. So, I give you these two for you to draw your own conclusion, because I have my idea, and yet I understand what both of these men are saying concerning the arguments that they made. And if I take the scriptures as they are literally given, then I too would have to accept the fact that he offered her as a burnt offering. And then yet there's other verses that shows that she was alive months after this event took place. So there's still that little thin ice, I guess you might call it. But I thought it would be at least well enough to us to look at the possible explanations as to why some believe that she was consecrated as Hannah consecrated Samuel, or whether or not she was literally sacrificed, even though that obviously would have been an abomination before God, but yet, and Jephthah is mentioned in Hebrews 11, is it not? Gilead is mentioned in Hebrews 11. And yet we know that there had to be parts of their life that were truly outstanding for the fact being that they are mentioned in what we sometimes refer to as the Hall of Faith. So, the lesson, keeping our word. As Christians, there's a vital lesson that we must learn from this story. David spoke about the characteristics of people who will dwell with the Lord. Psalms 15, verse 4, Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? He who swears to his own hurt and does not change. See, one of the characteristics of the people of God who will dwell with the Lord are the people that keep the word. And this is what describes Jephthah. And this should also be the same thing that can be said about us. May we never make promises that we're not able to keep. Because when we don't keep our word, we lose our credibility. God holds us accountable for the words that we say. I'm sure we recall Matthew 12, verse 36 and 37, where Jesus said, but I say to you that every idle word that men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. And then there's the passage in Matthew 5, verse 37. Let your yes be yes, and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one. So, in examining this as a lesson, can people trust us with our words? Are they able to believe us when we say something? Are we truthful with the words that we say? You see, Jephthah had, even though he made a hasty vow, and that's, if you ever hear a lesson on him, that will almost be the word that you'll hear a preacher or someone else use to describe this vow. It was a hasty vow. So even though he made a hasty vow, he still kept his word. And the second lesson, we can suffer because of the sins of others. We see that in him because, as we found in verse 1, his mother was a prostitute. Well, not only was his mother a prostitute, but there was an act of fornication on the part of his father, was there not? His father was with a prostitute, and the result was the birth of Jephthah. All right? We see that his father sinned, and Jephthah came into the world with the fact that he is an illegitimate son. And obviously, at a very young age, he had to deal with the results of his father's sin. You see, when his half-brothers grew up, and it was time to divide the inheritance in chapter 11 and verse 2, Jephthah was rejected by his brothers. You see, this had to be a very painful experience for Jephthah. And starting from childhood, he could have been the subject of ridicule from his brothers and from the people that were around him. You know, imagine how we would feel that even our own family has turned against us. And what we see is that the main reason here is people can suffer. The main lesson here is that people can suffer because of the sins of others. And let us too understand that when we see a person suffering, or whatever it may be, it's wrong to just automatically assume that people are suffering because of their own sins. I think that's something easy, a conclusion that is quick to jump to. But, and that's not to say that we don't suffer from our own sins, because yes, our own sins and our bad choices can and do cause us to suffer. But as Christians, we need to always remember our sins will not just affect us, but also the people that are around us. And this should be one of the reasons why that we ought not to commit sin. Just one of the reasons, because there are many, many other reasons. The chief reason is that the sin is to go against God. But then let's understand that there is possibly the lesser reason to realize that we're not just hurting ourselves, we're hurting others. We need to realize that sin will lead to our own suffering and the suffering of others. So what should we do if we suffer because of the sins of others? You know, there was a lot of circumstances in our lives that really we don't have any control over. But we can control how we react. Jephthah did not let his past or the sin of his father direct his future. And instead of pitying himself and dreading the fact that he was an illegitimate son, he tried to compensate by accepting his weakness and building on his strength. He became a mighty warrior and a man of valor. Going back to chapter 11, verse 1. The people recognized his strength. They recognized it to the point that they looked to him as their leader instead of just, a kid from a prostitute mother. And so we must do likewise. Instead of being sad and being disheartened over the suffering that we're experiencing because of the sins of others, we need to realize that there's always hope. Let's remember this verse, or these verses. James 1, verses 2, 3, and 4. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. And I think there's a third lesson. Let us be close to God, not only during the bad times. You see, Jephthah was an unwanted, he was an unappreciated man in his family and in the entire community. His brothers saw him as someone that was just going to diminish the inheritance that they were going to receive, and so they chased him away. Not only that, there can be no doubt that they treated Jephthah so bad that he was forced to leave home. But when things went bad for the Gileadites, where did they turn? See, they turned to the same person they rejected. Just because they didn't see any benefit from having Jephthah around, they are more than happy to get rid of it. And yet, when the going got rough, then they were quick in calling the man who could deliver them from the hands of the Ammonites. Let's reread Judges 11, verse 5. So it was when the people of Ammon made war against Israel that the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the hand of Tola. Then they said to Jephthah, come and be our commander, that we may fight against the people of Ammon. So Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, did you not hate me and expel me from my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you are in distress? And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, that is why we have turned again to you now, that you may go with us and fight against the people of Ammon and be our head over all of the inhabitants of Gilead. But sadly, this attitude hasn't gone away. We see people who easily forget God when they lack nothing. They're too proud to call on the Lord, too proud to bend their knees, too proud to pray to God because of the many blessings that they enjoy. But when things get difficult and all else fails, they turn to God as a last resort. And you know, God is not a spare tire that we only notice when we have a flat. How often do you think about your spare tire? Most time it's out of sight. It's either up under the luggage carrier where it's covered up and you don't see it, or else it's up under the vehicle. And unless you're a mechanic and get under there to grease it, you never see it. But whenever you have a flat, guess what comes to mind? Get the spare. But God's not like that. God doesn't need to be treated like that. We must have a close relationship with God to the point that He is the center of our lives. It's better to live a life constantly close to God rather than just remembering when tragedy arises. We must remember there are very well may come a time when we will seek God and He will no longer be found. Isaiah 55, verse 6. Seek the Lord while He may be found. Call upon Him while He is near. But then look at Proverbs chapter 1. Because I have called and you refused, I've stretched out my hand and no one regarded. Because you disdained all of my counsel and would have none of my rebuke, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your terror comes. When your terror comes like a storm and your destruction comes like a whirlwind. When distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord God. So I think that there's three very significant lessons that we can learn from the life of Jephthah. And our time is up, and Lord willing, 2 weeks, with the meeting going on next week, but 2 weeks from tonight, Lord willing, we want to look at, don't look at you, huh? Okay. Anyway, we're going to look at these three, which is about like the first two that we looked in our study tonight. Not a whole lot to be found about them, but Samson is of a different sort. There is a whole lot to be found about Samson. So, with that in mind, start reading at verse 8, where we left off in chapter 12, and go all the way through all 31 verses of chapter 16. So, that's quite a bit of reading because there is quite a bit that's given us and a lot of lessons that we can learn from just Samson. So, thank you so much for our study and the time that we have together.